go ahead and record as well. Alright. If anyone is here, we're just sending out the links and then we'll get started after a bit. For people to come on in. Sandy Mitchell. Sandy Mitchell, best artist. Not artist, author. Oh no, I feel bad. Someone posted. I'm not. So, that's first street. Alright. We got the links out to everybody. All the places I like sending them. We'll go ahead and wait a bit, see if some people will come chat with us. Well, give it a wait. I'm very excited because we only need well, I say only. That's still a lot of people. Let me make sure I can hear myself. Good, 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 good. Everything's good. You just need to wait for some people to come in, and it'll be fine. I'm gonna adjust things while I'm waiting. How's this? Does this sound okay? Does this sound okay? I think that sounds pretty good. How's this sound? Woo! Blah, 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 blah. I don't want to be my own viewer, but I need to make sure everything's working. How's this sound? Looks like it sounds good. Go back to our regular thing here. And we'll go ahead and wait to see if we get some people coming in here. I'm very excited. Just because I love the idea of the stream. It's really fun. I hope whoever does stop by is caught up. Hi, Fizzy! Are you ready for story time? I'm in here. I'm in my pajamas. I got my sleepy cap on. We got Barry. Sure. I'm ready. It'll be fun. We're gonna wait just a little bit here and then we'll start. Probably just a couple minutes or so. I haven't. Hey, story time is the perfect lurking time. Hell, thank you all for coming. This is the perfect lurking time, and I'm you're just listening to Audible right now. That's basically it. Oh, that's my desk. I am Cormano the Mage. I'll be your voice actor for this evening for this audiobook. We'll go ahead and give it just about a minute or so, and we'll get started. And I am recording this one as well, and I hopefully won't need to mess with audio like I did the last one, so then it'll actually look good because the video editor I used last time messed everything up. But it's fine. We are on chapter. Oh, if our chapters were numbered. Chapters. Oh, there. This is going to be we'll be starting on an editorial chapter from Amberley. So get your lore caps on. We'll be doing. All right. I'd say it's time to get started. I should have pulled my hair back. And we begin. Editorial note. Given Kane's complete and typical lack of interest in anything that doesn't concern him directly, the following extract may prove useful in placing the rest of his narrative in a wider context. It must be said that the book from which it comes isn't the most reliable of guides to the campaign as a whole, but it does, unlike most studies into the Gravilax incident, at least attempt to sketch in the historical background to the conflict. Despite the author's obvious limitations as a chronicler of events, his summing up of the cautious belly is substantially correct. From Purge the Guilty, an impartial account of the liberation of Gravilax, by Centenius Logar, 085 M42. The seeds of the Gravilax incident were sown many years before the full magnitude of the crisis were realized, and, in retrospect, it may be easy to discern the slow unfolding of an abhuman conspiracy over the span of several generations. A historian, however, has the perspective of hindsight, which, alas, cannot be said of the actual participants. So, rather than pointing an accusatory finger with righteous cries of how could they have been so stupid, it behooves us to shake our heads in pity as we contemplate our forebears blind, stumbling into the brink of destruction. It goes without saying that no blame can be attached to the servants of the Emperor, particularly those concerned with the ordering His Divine Majesty's fighting forces and the diligent adepts of the Administratum. The Ultima Segmentum is vast, and the Damocles Gulf is an obscure frontier sector. After the heathen Tau were put in their place by the heroic Crusader fleet in the early 740s, attention rightly shifted to more immediate threats. The incursion of High Fleet Leviathan, the awakening of the accursed Necrons, and the ever-present danger from the traitor legions, not least among them. Nevertheless, the Tau presence remained on the fringes of Imperial space, and all but unnoticed, they began once again to encroach on His Divine Majesty's blessed domains. Up until this point, Gravelax had been an obscure outpost of civilization, barely noticed by the wider galaxy. Enough of its landmasses were fertile to keep its relatively sparse population tolerably well fed, and it possessed adequate mineral reserves for such industry as it supported. In short, it had nothing to attract any trade and an insignificant population base to be worth fighting or to be worth tithing for the Imperial Guard. It was, to be blunt, a backwater, devoid of anything of interest. If Gravelax thought it was to remain undisturbed indefinitely, however, it was sadly mistaken. Within a century of their drubbing at the righteous hands of the servants of the Imperium, the black-hearted Tau were back, spreading their poisonous heresies through the Gulf once more. When they first chanced upon Gravelax, no one knows.
7. 837 M41, according to the surviving records. Like many amateur historians, Logar is long on rhetoric and short on actual scholarship.
But by the turn of the last century of the millennium, they were well established there. Occasionally, Amberly will cut in with little tidbits. So whenever I say a number and I change voices, that's the little tidbit. It will come as no surprise to my readers, aware as we must be of the innate treachery of all aliens, as they had arrived at this pass by an insidious process of infiltration. And, shocking though as it is to record it, but with the willing assistance of those whose greed and thoughtlessness made from the perfect dupes of this monstrous conspiracy, I refer, as you have no doubt already guessed, to the so-called rogue traitors. Rogues, indeed, who would place their own interests above those of the Imperium, humanity, and the divine Emperor himself.
Several paragraphs of inflammatory but non-specific denunciation of rogue traitors omitted. Logar seems to have something of an obsession about their untrustworthiness. Perhaps one owed him money.
Rogue traders are basically space pirates. They are space pirates, mercenaries. They get to kind of do whatever they want because the Imperium is way too big to govern it all. How and why these pariahs of profit first began trafficking with the Tau, history does not record.
8. Or Lorgar couldn't be bothered to do the research.
What is certain is that Gravelax, with its isolated position on the fringes of Imperial space and close to the expanding sphere of influence of these malign aliens, became the perfect meeting place for such clandestine exchanges. Inevitably, the corruption spread. As trade increased, it became more open, with Tau vessels becoming a common sight at the new and expanding starports. Tau themselves began to be seen on the streets of Gravelaxian cities, mingling with the populace, painting their human purity with their soulless alien ways. Heresy began to run rife, even ordinary citizens daring to use blasphemous devices unblessed by the tech priests supplied by their insidious off-world allies. Something had to be done, and at last it was. The rising stench of corruption eventually attracted the ceaseless vigilance of the Inquisition, which lost no time in demanding dispatch of a task force of the Imperium's finest warriors to purge this festering boil in the body of His Holiness's blessed dements. And that's precisely what they got. For in the vanguard of this glorious endeavor was none other than Caiaphas Cain, the martial hero whose very name the enemies of humanity trembled in terror.
Chapter 3. Old friends are like debt collectors. They have a tendency to turn up when you least expect them. Gilbrand Quayle, Collected Essays. As I've rattled around the galaxy, I've seen a great many cities, from the soaring spires of Holy Terra itself to the blood-choked gutters of some Eldar Reaver carnal pit. 9. Kane was part of the invasion force which cleansed Sanguia. His account of this action is recorded elsewhere in the archive. But I've seldom seen anything stranger than the broad thoroughfares of Mayo, the planetary capital of Gravelax. We disembarked in good order, the freshly assumed banner of the 597th snapping proudly in the breeze that blew in gently across the rock-creek hectares of the starport as the Valhallans formed up by company, and I resisted the temptation to lean across and compliment Sula on her needlepoint. I doubt that she had anything to do with procuring it, but it wasn't that which dissuaded me. She wasn't the kind to take a joke, and was still harboring a germ of resentment at the organizational changes I instituted. We were a fine sight to behold, but I have to admit the other regiments glancing in the sidelongs as they marched away, although that made us a bit surprised when they realized we were a mixed unit. 10. It was hardly unprecedented for men and women to serve together in the Imperial Guard. Notable units in which this was the norm included the Omicron Rangers, the Teneth First, and Calderan Rifles. However, with women making up fewer than 10% of the total under arms, and the vast majority of those serving in single-sex regiments, it wouldn't be that surprising if the 597th excited a certain amount of curiosity among the onlookers present.
All present accounted for, Colonel.
Brocklor snapped a drill manual salute and fell into place beside Castine. She nodded, inflated her chest, and then hesitated on the verge of giving the command. Commissar, she said, I think the honor should be yours. This regiment wouldn't even exist if it wasn't for you. I don't mind admitting I was touched. Although I have overall authority in whatever unit I'm attached to, commissars are always outside the regular chain of command, which means I really don't fit anywhere. By letting me give the order to move out, she was demonstrating in the most practical form imaginable that I was as much part of the 597th as herself or Brocklor, or the humblest latrine orderly. The unaccustomed sense of belonging choked me for a moment, before the more rational part of my mind started gloating about how much that would mean in facilitating my own survival. I nodded, making sure I looked suitably moved. Thank you, Colonel, I said simply, but I believe the honor belongs to us all. Then I filled my chest and bellowed, Move out! And so we did. And if you think that sounds like a simple proposition, you haven't thought it through. To put it in some kind of perspective, a regiment consists up to half a dozen companies, the 5 in our case, most of which had 4 or 5 platoons. The exception was 3rd Company, which was our logistical support arm, and consisted mainly of transport vehicles, engineering units, and anything else we couldn't find a sensible place for on the SOE. All told, that came to much the same thing in a head count. Factor in 5 squads of platoon and 10 troopers each, plus a command element to keep them all in line, you're looking at nearly 1,000 people by the time you've added in the various specialists and different layers of the overall command structure. Just to add to the confusion, Castine had decided to split the squads into 5-man fire teams, anticipating that any open conflict was likely to take place in and around the urban areas. Beating off the Tyranids on Corania had convinced her that smaller formations were easier to coordinate in a city fight than full-length squads. 11. A widespread, though unofficial practice among units experienced in urban warfare. So much so that it has now become part of the standard operating procedure in many regiments. The ad hoc arrangement persisting to become a permanent feature of their organization. All of this made for a fine martial display as we moved out, you can be sure. With banners flying and the band thumping and popping away at If I Should Forget Thee, O Terror, as though they had a grudge against the imposer. There hadn't really been time for rehearsals, what with all the excitement for the righteous wrath. But if they were making up an enthusiasm for whatever, but they were making up in enthusiasm for whatever they lacked in proficiency. And a high old time was being held by all. It was a fine, fresh day, with a faint taste of salt in the breeze from the nearby ocean. At least until our chimeras and transport trucks started up and began farting promethium fumes into the air. We intended to make an impression with our arrival, and by the Emperor we surely did, setting out to march the 10 kilometers or so into the city. 12. Kilometers, a Valhallan slang abbreviation for kilometer. Kane served with the Valhallan units for most of his life, and almost inevitably his speech became peppered with colloquialisms acquired from them. Most of the troopers were glad of the exercise, reveling in the fresh air and sunshine after so long between decks, and swung along the highway, las guns at the slope. Being an old hive boy myself, it was all one to me. But I was affected by the general holiday atmosphere, I think, and I don't mind admitting to the general diffused glow of well-being as we got underway. Castine and Brocklor couldn't march, of course, having to look grander than the common ground pounders, and so trundled along at the front of the regiment in a salamander, and I seized the excuse to do the same. We can't have the regiment's most vital officers plotting behind my back, I said at the briefing, smiling to show I didn't mean it, and pouring everyone a fresh cup of recaf to show I was part of the team. So I lounged back in the open compartment of the rear scout variant, which Jurgen kept half the track's length behind theirs, in interest of protocol and reinforcing the impression of my generally assumed modesty, and took the opportunity to feel rather pleased with myself. The synchronized slapping of 2,000 boot soles on the surface of the highway and the squarking of the band almost drowned out the throb of our engine. Oh, I must have looked like a splendid sight as we left the main cargo gate of the starport behind us and began to approach the city. It was then that my palms began to itch again. There was nothing I could finger on initially to explain my gradually intensifying sense of disquiet, but something was definitely tapping my subconscious on the shoulder and whispering, "That's not right." As we entered the city itself, my disquiet grew. I wasn't surprised to see the streets free of traffic, the local authorities having cleared the way for us. 1,000 troopers and their ancillary equipment took up a lot of room, and we are far from the first regiment to have disembarked. Indeed, the occasional muffled curse from behind me which cut through the din made it all too clear that the front few ranks would have preferred it if the Rough Riders could have been held back a while longer instead of being set through immediately ahead of us. The Rough Riders, or the Attilian Rough Riders, is a guard regiment that are all on horses. They do a lot of horseback riding, horseback warfare in the space universe. That's how silly this universe gets. Also, they stink really bad. Come to that, I don't suppose Castine was too thrilled about having to gaze at a street with of horse arses for the duration of our march either. But the broad thoroughfares were a little too quiet for my liking, and a little too open as well. I'm not agoraphobic by any means, not like some hivers who never feel comfortable under an open sky, but there was something about those wide streets that made me think of snipers and ambush. That made me scan the buildings as we passed, and my unease grew the more I saw of them. There was nothing wrong with them as such, not like the bizarre architectural forms of chaos incursion which seems to twist reality and which hurt to look upon, or the brutal slapdash functionalism of orcish habitations. But there was something in their sweeping forms which seemed vaguely inhuman, and I was to put it in mind of some Eldar architecture by their elegant simplicity, and then it finally hit me. There were no right angles anywhere. Even in the even the corners had been rounded and smooth, but beneath the strange styling, the shapes were clearly those of warehouses, apartments, blocks, and manufactura. And though the whole city had been left out in the sun, as if the whole city had been left out in the sun too long and had started to melt. That alone should have been enough warning of an insidious alien influence at work here, but before we reached our destination, I was to see far more than that. There's something seriously wrong here, I said to Jurgen, who looked up briefly from the road ahead and nodded in agreement with me. Something doesn't quite smell right, he agreed, without a trace of irony. Have you seen the civilians? Now that he came to mention it, there were remarkably few of them lining the route. Normally, a big military parade would have brought them out in droves, waving their Aquila flags and their icons of the Divine One, cheering themselves hoarse to see so many of the Emperor's finest ready to see off the foe so that they could scuttle back to their meaningless lives without the fear of having to fight for themselves. But the pavements were half empty, and for every shopkeeper or habwife or juvie who cheered and waved or smiled wanly at us with sidelong glances at their neighbors, there were just as many who scowled or glared at their neighbors, or who glared and scowled at us. That put a shiver down my spine, awakening uncomfortable and all too recent memories of the mess hall riot and the blood-matted troopers a hair from turning on me. At least no one was shouting or throwing things, yet, but I reached down unobtrusively and loosened my lance pistol and my trusty chainsword, ready to be drawn in a hurry if I needed them. As if right on cue, I noticed the first of the banners. "Murderers go home," it said in shaky capitals, hand-lettered on what looked like an old bedsheet someone had strung in front of what looked like a illuminator pole so that it hung across the street, comfortably above head height, but low enough to brush irritably against the overhead and shoulders of anyone riding in a vehicle. Or on a horse, for that matter, as I watched one of the Rough Riders reach up and irritably tear it down. Bad move, I said to myself, expecting some trouble from the crowd, but beyond a little catcalling from a small knot of juvies, nothing happened. But I was getting a distinctly uncomfortable feeling about all of this. There was a perceptible undercurrent of tension in the air now, like a fainter echo in the incipient violence I felt aboard the righteous wrath. "Go back to your emperor and leave us alone!" a pretty girl shouted, her head shaven, apart from a single shoulder-length braid. And I felt as though I'd been doused with a cold water. "Your emperor?" The words had been unmistakable. "Heretics!" Jurgen said with loathing. I nodded, still unable to credit it. Could the great enemy have a foothold here as well as the Tau? But common sense argued against it. If that were the case, we'd have bombarded the place from orbit, surely, and the Astartes would have been sent in to cut out the cancer before it could spread. Things weren't as far gone as I feared, however. As I turned to look back, a squad of Arbites forced their way through the crowd and began laying into the juvies with shock batons. Good order was still being maintained here by the Emperor's grace, but for how much longer? That I might very much feared depended on us. We reached our staging area without further incident, vanning throughout a complex of warehouses and manufactura which had been set aside for our use. We weren't the only regiment quartered there, I recall, as the Imperium had been fortifying against the expected incursions of the Tau for some time, and I gathered that the Righteous Wrath's complement, 3 full regiments apart from our own, brought the total up to around 30,000 all told. That should have been more than enough to keep a backwater planet. Oh, am I on the right page? Yeah. Keep a backwater planet even spread out across the whole globe. But rumor had it we could expect still more reinforcement, which worried me more than I wanted to show. With that amount of build-up, it seemed the aliens wanted this place quite badly, and we'd more than likely be expected to hold it the hard way. We were quartered next to one of the Valhallan armored regiments, the 14th, I think. But I couldn't tell you who most of the others were. There was a definite evidence that the Rough Riders were still somewhere in the vicinity, though, so you had to watch your feet. But apart from that, I hadn't a clue. Except for one of the unit I already knew well, of course, which I come to in a moment. I was still feeling spooked from our journey up through the town, so I was relieved to come across Brocklore posting sentries around our corner of the compound as I left Jurgen to sort out my quarters and went for a wander around to get my bearings. I haven't even reached my second sentry by not knowing where the best bolt holes and lines of retreat are, and finding them was always a high priority for me whenever I found myself somewhere new. Excuse me. Goodness. Good thinking, Major, I complimented him, and he gave me a wry grin.
Should be safe enough here, he said. But it never hurts to be careful.
I know what you mean, I agreed. There's something about this place which really gets under my skin. The warehouses around us all had that peculiar rounded-off look I noticed before, and the subtle sense of wrongness left a vague apprehension hovering around me like Jurgen's body odor. The Major knew his business, though, setting up las cannon and sandbag emplacements to cover the gaps between the buildings around us, and sharpshooters on the roof. I was just admiring his thoroughness when the ground began to shake and a couple of our sentinels appeared, clanking and humming, and swiveling their heavy multi-lasers as they took up position in front of the main loading doors, which gave access to the ground floor where our vehicles were parked. Somewhat reassured by this, I made my way across the compound, passing into areas controlled by other units, watching the familiar bustle of troopers coming and going, and finding the familiar air of controlled chaos and the constant background hum of the vehicle engines and profanity curiously soothing. I wasn't quite sure how far I'd gone when an engine note, both louder and deeper than the others, cut through the babble of noise around me. For a moment, I was assailed by that formless sense of recognition that when you get something you once knew so well, you never registered, consciously comes back to a notice after a passage of years. And then I turned my head with a nostalgic smile. A Trojan heavy hauler, with an earth-shaker howitzer in tow, was growling its way across a vast open area which had probably once been used to park the private vehicles of the workers who toiled here in happier times, but which was now choked with equipment and supplies. I hadn't seen one of those close up in a long time, but I recognized it at once, having started my long and inglorious career in an obscure artillery unit. The flood of memories the sight brought back, a few of them even pleasant, was so overwhelming that for a moment I was unaware of the voice calling my name. Kai! Over here! Now, I have never been what you'd call an oversupplied with friends, it goes with the job, I suppose. But a few I've acquired over the years, only one has ever had the presumption to use the familiar form of my given name. So, despite the changes that the years since I'd seen him had wrought, there was no mistaking the officer who was running across the compound towards me, grinning like an idiot. Torin! I called back, as he sidestepped another Trojan just in time to avoid being squashed in the tarmac like a bug. When did they make you a major? The last time I'd seen Torin Divas, he had just made captain and was nursing a hangover as he saw me off of the 12th Field Artillery. I remember thinking at the time he was probably the only man in the battery who was sorry to see me go. And what in the Emperor's ass are you doing here? Same to you, I suppose. He came panting up to me, the familiar lopsided grin on his face. Keeping order and purging the heretics. The same old thing. There were streaks of gray in his temples now, I noticed, and his belt was out another notch. But the same air of boyish enthusiasm still hung around him as the day we first met. I'm surprised to see you on a backwater like this. Same here, I said. I turned my head, taking in the bustle surrounding us. It seems like an awful lot of firepower to put a frighteners on a bunch of stroppy provincials. Jesus, Kane, you wanna lay off the purple words there? If the town mobilized, we'll need every bit of it, Diva said. Some of our war gear has to be seen to be believed. They've got these things like dreadnoughts, but they're fast, like Astartes infantry, but twice the size. And their tanks make the Eldar stuff look like they were built by orcs. As usual, he seemed to be relishing the prospect of combat, which is easy to do when you're kilometers behind the front line, chucking shells into the distance. But not so much fun when you're facing an enemy close enough to spit at you. And if that's all they've got in mind, make yourselves lucky, unless they're one of those Emperor-forsaken Xenos that come equipped with the venom sacs. But it won't come to that, surely, I said. Now we're here, they'll be mad to attempt a landing. To my astonishment, Divas laughed. They won't have to. They're already here. This was new and unwelcomed information. I goggled at him in surprise. Since when? I gasped. Now, I'd be the first to admit that I'm seldom that diligent when it comes to reading the briefing slate, but I was sure to have noticed something that crucial to my well-being in a cursory glance through it. Diva shrugged. About 6 months, apparently. They were already deployed on the planet when the cleansing flame dropped us off here 3 weeks ago. This was seriously bad news. I've been looking forward to a nice brisk round of target practice on civilian rioters, or at worst a turkey shoot against the odd renegade PDF unit. PDF is Planetary Defense Force. Now we were facing a foe that could give us a real run for our money. Emperor's bowels. If half of what I've heard about the town and their technology was true, we could be the ones getting our arses kicked. Divas grinned at my expression, misinterpreting it entirely. So you can see some fun after all, he said, clapping me on the back. I could have killed him. I didn't, of course. For one thing, as I've said, I don't have too many friends that I can afford to waste them, and for another, Divas had been there long enough to pick up some vital information which I currently lacked. Namely, the location of the nearest bar we could get to without attracting too much attention ourselves. So we set out through the streets of Mayo together, my commissar's uniform getting us to the guard at the compound gate without any argument. Although, he did give us a word of caution. Be careful, sir. There's been disturbances up in the heights. They say. 13. The most affluent area of the city, where it began to rise up into the surrounding hills. Though Tao influence on the local architecture was widespread, as Kay notes elsewhere, it was more overt here than anywhere else in Mayo. As a result, it was popular with the most radical of the pro-Tao citizens and a natural focus of protest for the imperial loyalists. As the political situation continued to deteriorate, the clashes between the two factions became commonplace here. That meant nothing to me, so I smiled and nodded, and said we'd be careful, and checked with Divas that we'd be going nowhere near there as soon as we were out of earshot.
Good Emperor, no, he said, frowning. It's crawling with heretics. The only way you'd catch me up there is with a squadron of hellhounds to cleanse the place. Needless to say, he'd never seen what incendiary weapons can do to a man, or he wouldn't be half so keen on the idea.
I have, and I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. Actually, there are one or two I would wish it on, come to think of it, and sit there happily roasting cabanuts while they screamed. But they're all dead now, anyways, so it was beside the point. So, where did they all come from? I asked, as we made our way through the streets. Dusk was falling now, the illuminators and cafe signs flickering to life, and the swirl of bodies around us growing thicker as the night descended. Small knots of passersby stood aside to let us pass, intimidated no doubt by our imperial uniforms and the visible sidearms we carried, some with respect and others resentful. Several of the latter had the curious tonsure of the heretic Juvie had sported. Their heads shaved except for one long scalp lock. The significance of it wasn't to dawn on me until some time later, but even then I realized it was a badge of allegiance of some kind, and that those who bore it were liable to turn traitor as the shooting started. For now, they were content to merely mutter insults under their breath. "They're locals," Diva said, not denying to notice them, which was fine by me. Of all the ways I could have ended up dead over the years, getting sucked into a pointless street brawl would have been among the most embarrassing. The whole planet's infested with Xeno lovers. A bit of an exaggeration, that, but he was more or less right, as I was later to discover. To cut a long story short, the locals have been trading with the Tau for several generations by now, which wasn't terribly sensible, but what can you expect from a bunch of backwater peasants? The end result was that most of them were quite used to seeing Xenos around the place, and despite the sterling efforts of the local ecclesiarch to warn them that no good would come of it, a lot of them had started to absorb unhealthy ideas from them. Which was where we came in, ready to guide them back into the imperial fold before they came to too much harm. And all very noble of us to do so. I'm sure you'll agree. "The trouble is," Divas concluded, downing the rest of his third emisec in one, "the hardcore are so far gone, they don't see it like that. They think the Tau are the best thing to the galaxy since the Emperor was a nappies, and we're the big bad bullies here to take their shiny new toys away." "Well, that might be a little more difficult now that the Tau are digging in," I said. "But I'm surprised they're prepared to risk it." I followed suit, feeling the smoky liquor warming its way down to my chest. "They must know we'll never allow them to annex the place without a fight." "They claim they're here to just safeguard their trading interests," Diva said. We both snorted with laughter at once. But we knew how often the Imperium had said the exact same thing before launching an all-out invasion of some luckless ball of dirt. Of course, when we did it, it was true. It was my job to shoot anyone who thought otherwise. "One for the diplomats, then," I said, signaling for another round. A nicely rounded waitress bustled over, full of patriotic fervor, and replenished our glasses. One thing I can say for Divas, he knew how to find a good bar. This one, the Eagle's Wing, was definitely in the loyalist camp. The wide, smoky cellar, full of Planetary Defense Force regulars, were delighted to see some real soldiers at last, and fulminating at the governor for not letting them loose on the aliens years ago. The owner was a corporal in the PDF reserves, recently retired after 20 years of service, and couldn't seem to get over the honor of having a couple of real guard officers in the place. And once Divas had introduced me, and I had been appropriately modest about my earlier adventures in the Emperor's name, there was no question of us having to pay the bill either. After signing autographs for some of the civilian customers, all of whom urged us to pot a few of the little blue bastards on their behalf, and the charming the waitress had begun to call, we retreated to a quiet side booth where we could talk uninterrupted. I think the diplomats could be getting a little help on this one, Diva said, tapping the side of his nose conspiratorially as he lifted the glass. I drank a little more slowly, acutely aware that we had started to make our way back to the potentially hostile cities, and wanted to keep a reasonably clear head. Help from who? I asked. Who do you think? Divas dipped his finger in the glass and sketched a stylized letter with a pair of crossbars bisecting it on the surface of the table before erasing it with a sweep of his hand. I laughed. Oh, right. Them. I've yet to arrive at any place where the political situation's fluid without hearing rumors of Inquisition agents beavering away behind the scenes. And unless I happen to be the errand boy in question, I never believed a word of it. On the other hand, if there aren't any rumors, then they probably are up to some mischief. No mistake about it. 14. A reasonable assumption on both accounts. Details of Kane's subsequent activities as my errand boy, as he puts it, can be found in the Ordo's Libram. That's a weird word. Why, just say library. In the Ordo's Libram, if any readers care to check the official accounts. His own version of these events can be found elsewhere in the archive, but need not concern us at the moment. You can laugh. Divas finished his drink and replaced the glass on the table. But I heard it from one of the administratum adepts, who swore he got it from somewhere or other. An expression of faint bewilderment drifted across his face. I think I need some fresh air. I think you need too, I said, leaving aside what I thought then were ridiculous fantasies about the Inquisition. He'd still given me a lot to think about. The situation here was undoubtedly far more complex than I had been led to believe, and I needed to consider things carefully. Soon we took our leave of our kindly hosts, the waitress in particular looking sorry to see me go, and staggering up the stairway and into the street. The cold night air hit me like a refreshing shower, snapping me back to alertness, and I glanced around while Divas communed loudly with the Emperor in the convenient gutter. Fortunately, the bar he'd steered us was down a quiet side alley, so no one saw the dignity of the Imperial uniform being sullied. Once I was sure there were no more eruptions to come, I helped him to his feet. You used to be able to hold it better than that, I chided, and he shook his head mournfully. Local rot gut. Not like the stuff we used to drink. And I should have eaten something. It would have been a wasted effort, I consoled him, and glanced around, trying to get our bearings. Where the frack are we, anyways? Dock zone, he said confidently, hardly swaying on his feet at all now. This way! He strode off towards the nearest illuminated thoroughfare. I shrugged and followed him. After all, he had 3 weeks to get his bearings. As we made our way through the well-lit street, however, I began to feel apprehensive. True, we'd been deep in our conversation on the way to the bar, but none of the landmarks looked familiar to me, and I began to wonder if his confidence had been displaced. Torin, I said after a while, noticing a gradual increase in the number of scap-locks and murderous glances along the passers-by. Are you sure this is the way back to our staging area? Not ours, he said, the grin on his face. Theirs! Thought you'd like to get a good look at the enemy. You thought what? I yelped, amazed at his stupidity. Then I remembered Divas bought the myth of my purported heroism completely and without question, and had done ever since he'd seen me take on an entire Tyranid swarm, with just a chainsword when we were callow youths together, purely by accident, as it happened. I had no idea the damn bugs were even there until I blundered into them, and if I hadn't ended up inadvertently leading them to the beaten zone of our heavy ordnance and saving the day, they'd have torn me into pieces. Waltzing up to the enemy encampment and thumbing our noses at them probably struck him as the kind of thing I did for fun. Are you out of your mind? It's perfectly safe, he said. We're not officially at war with them yet. Well, that was true, but I still wasn't keen on jumping the gun. And until we are, we're not going to provoke them, I said, in all commissario duty. Divas' face fell like a child denied a sweet, and I thought I'd better put a gloss on it that would match his expectations of me. We can't put our own amusement ahead of our responsibilities to the Emperor, however tempting as it is. I suppose you're right, he said reluctantly, and I began to breathe a little more easily. Now, all I had to do was maneuver him back to the barracks before he got any more stupid ideas. So I took him by the arm and turned him around. Now, how do we get back to our compound? How about in a body bag? Somebody asked. I turned, feeling my stomach drop. About a dozen locals stood between us and the streetlights striking highlights from their shaven heads. A variety of improvised weapons hanging profusely from their hands. They looked tough, at least in their own minds, but when you've been face to face with orcs and Eldar Reaver slavers, you don't intimidate that easily. Well, alright, I do, but I don't show it, which is the main thing. Besides, I had a las pistol and a chainsaw, which, in my experience, trumps over a crowbar every time. So I laid a restraining hand on Divas' shoulder as he was still intoxicated enough to rise to the bait, and smiled lazily. Believe me, I said, you don't want to start anything. You don't tell me what I want. The group's spokesman, stepped forward into the light. Fine, I thought, keep them talking. That's what you Imperials do, isn't it? I don't quite follow, I said, affecting mild curiosity. Movement out of the corner of my eye told me that our retreat had been cut off. A second group emerged from the alley, mouth behind us. I started calculating the odds. If I had made a move to draw the las pistol, they'd rush me, but I'd probably manage to get a shot off. If I took their leader with it and ran forward at the same time, I stood a good chance of breaking through the line and making a run for it. That assumed they'd be surprised or intimidated enough to hesitate, of course. And I was able to open up a decent lead. With any luck, they'd turn on Divas, buying me enough time to get away. But I couldn't be sure of that, so I continued to play for time and look for a better chance. You're here to take our world, the leader shouted, and he came forward fully into the light. I could see that his face was painted blue, a delicate pastel shade. It should have made him look ridiculous, but the overall effect was somehow charismatic. But you'll never take our freedom! Your freedom is here! Your freedom is here! I tried that twice. Your freedom is what we're to give you, you Xeno-hugging moron! Divas broke free of my restraining arm and lunged forward. But you're too brainwashed to see it! Great. So much for diplomacy. Still, he was set on reenacting Ganak's charge. I might be able to make a run for it. 15. Ganak's charge. A famous military blunder in the Spyron campaign, which took place on 438 926 M41. Captain Ganak's sentinel troop from the 3rd Kalaman Hussars misinterpreted their orders and charged an orc redoubt containing an artillery battery. No one survived. No such luck, of course. The surrounding heretics drove in on us at a concerted wedge. I just managed to draw my last pistol and snap off a shot, taking out the face of one of the group, which I'm bound to say didn't make much of a difference in the overall personal charm. Before an iron bar came hard down on my wrist. I've been in enough melee to have seen the blow coming and to have ridden it, which saved me from a fracture or worse. But that didn't help the pain, which exploded along my arm, deadening it. My fingers flew open, and I ducked, scrabbling after the precious weapon, but it was futile. A knee drove up into my ribs, slamming the breath from my lungs, and I was down, cold, hard rock, scraping the skin from my knuckles. The real ones, anyway. And knowing I was a dead man unless I could somehow get away. Torin! I screamed, but Divas had problems of his own by now, and wasn't going to get any help from that. I curled up, trying to protect my vital organs, and tried frantically to get at my chainsaw. Of course, I should have gone for that first, holding the mob at bay with it, but hindsight's about as much use as a heretic's oath, and now the bloody thing was trapped under my own body weight. I scrabbled frantically, feeling fists and boots thudding against my ribs. Luckily, there were so many of them that they were getting in each other's way. My uniform greatcoat was thick enough to absorb some of the impact. Or I'd been in even worse shape than I was. Something shrieked, an inhuman scream that raised the hairs of the back of my neck, even under those conditions. My assailants hesitated, and I rolled clear in time to see the largest of them yanked back by sheer brute force. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating, but the pain in my ribs was all too real. A face dominated by a large hooked beak was gazing down at me, surmounted by a crest of quills that had been dyed or painted in some elaborate pattern, and the hot, carnal breath washed across my face, making me gag. You are comparatively uninjured, the thing asked in curiously accented Gothic. It's hard to convey in writing, but its voice was glottal, most of the consonants reduced to a hard clicking sounds. It was perfectly understandable, mind you. My stupefaction was due entirely to the fact that something that looked like that was able to talk in the first place. Yes, thank you, I croaked after a moment. Whenever you don't have a clue what's going on, I've always found it never hurts to be polite. That is gratifying, the thing said, and threw the heretic in its left hand casually away. The others were standing around aimlessly now, like skulky Schola students when the tutor turns out to spoil the fun. Then it extended the same thin, scaly hand equipped with a dagger-like claws towards me. After a heart-stopping moment, I divined its intention and accepted the proffered assistance in gaining my feet. As I did so, it turned to the sullen group of heretics. "This does not advance the greater good," it said. "Disperse now, and avoid conflict." Well, that was a challenge if I'd ever heard one, but to my surprise, and I must admit, my intense relief, the little knot of troublemakers slunk away into the shadows. I eyed my rescuer a little apprehensively. He, or she, with crude, it's impossible to tell, was slightly taller than I was, and still looked pretty intimidating. They're tough enough. They're tough enough to take on an orc in hand-to-hand combat, and I for one wouldn't be betting on the green skin. But if it wanted me dead, it would only have to wait a few moments. I retrieved my fallen las pistol anyway, and tried to get my breath back. "I'm obliged to you," I said. "I must admit, I don't understand, but I'm grateful." I fumbled the weapon back into its holster with some difficulty. My arm was swelling up now, and my fingers felt thick and unresponsive. My rescuer made a curious clicking sound, which I assumed to be equivalent of laughter. "Imperial officers murdered by Tau supporters. Not a desirable outcome when the political situation is tense." "Not a desirable outcome at any time when one of them is me," I said, and the Xeno made the clicking noise again. That reminded me of Divas, and I scattered across to check on him. He was still breathing, but unconscious. A deep gash across his forehead. Like he got fucked up. I picked up enough battlefield medicine to know he'd recover soon enough. But have the Emperor's own headache when he woke. And that was fine by me. Serve the idiot right for nearly getting me killed. "I have the honor to be Gorak of the clan Cha," the creature said. "I am Groot." "I am Groot." "I know what you are," I said. "Groot killed my parents, and thereby got me dumped into the Schola Progemium, and thence into the Commissariat, instead of following my undoubted true destiny of running some discreet little house of ill repute for slumming spirits and guilders from the sump with more money than sense to splash around. I vaguely resented that far more than the loss of my progenitors, who hadn't been all that much to have around while they were alive, to be honest. But it never hurts to gather the moral high ground. My new acquaintance didn't seem terribly concerned, though. "I trust they fought well," he said. I doubted it. They only joined the guard to get out of the hive ahead of the Arbites, and would certainly have deserted the first chance they got. So it'd be something in genetics after all. "Not well enough," I said, and Gorak clicked in amusement again. It was a slightly unnerving experience. Feeling that something so unhuman was able to read me more readily than my own people. "Go carefully, Commissar," he said, "and feed on your enemies. Maybe you have no cause for conflict." Well, thank the Emperor for that. But somehow I doubted that it was going to happen, and of course I was right. I was surprised, though, by how quickly the crisis came upon us. We'll see if we can go for a little bit longer. Oh boy, it's lore time. Editorial note. It is perhaps worth pointing out at this juncture that the account of his background that Kane gives during his conversation with the Kroot, although superficially plausible, doesn't quite hold together on further examination. For one thing, admittance to the Schola Progemium is a privilege usually reserved for the offspring of officers. If he was indeed the son of common troopers, his parents must have acquitted themselves with singular valor in the action which resulted in their demise, which, to say the least, seems remarkably at odds with his characterization of them. Moreover, he implies that they enlisted and served together. I looked for a second at myself on the screen and lost my place immediately. Moreover, he implies that they enlisted and served together. Although mixed units are, as pointed out elsewhere, extremely not unheard of in the Imperial Guard, it would have been extremely unusual for this to have been the case. Kane makes frequent references throughout the archive to having been spent his early years on a hive world, but never specifies which one, which, in turn, makes the verification of any such claims virtually impossible. However, no hive world of which I'm aware of raised a mixed guard regiment in the time frame consistent with his narrative. We should also bear in mind that, by his own admission, the man was a pathological liar, given to saying things he judged would be effective in manipulating his listeners. I should explain a little bit here. A hive world is a hive city is basically a city that, like, you started to build a city and then it got dirty, so you built another one on top of it, and then that one got dirty, so you built another one on top of it, and then you kept doing that forever. And a hive world is an entire planet like that. Some people on those worlds don't even know what the sun is, or what a sun is. And Kane grew up on a hive city, which he will say frequently. We should also bear in mind. Oh, yeah. This dude lies. Oh, that was it. Okay. I thought there's usually more. Chapter 4. It's often remarked that diplomacy is just warfare by other means. Our battles are no less desperate for being bloodless, but at least we get wine and finger food. Talon for Lang, Imperial Envoy to the realm of Ultramar. 564 603 M41. Oh, okay. This is a good chapter. Are you sure it'll fit enough? Castine said, a faint frown of concern appearing between her eyebrows. I nodded and adjusted the sling I have adopted for dramatic effect. It was black silk, matching the ebony hues of my dress uniform, and making me look tolerably dashing, I thought. I'm fine, I said, smiling bravely. The other fellows got the worst of it. Thank the Emperor. In the day or two since the brawl with the heretics, my arm had more or less healed. The Medicaid assumed that I'd suffered nothing more worse than severe bruising. It was still stiff. It was still stiff. It ached a little, but all in all, I thought I'd come off lightly. Far better than Divas had anyway. He'd spent the night in the infirmary and still walked around with a stick. For all that, though, he was as irritatingly cheerful as ever, and I had been finding as many duties I could to keep me out of the way whenever he suggested socializing again. Luckily for me, he'd lost consciousness before the crew turned up, so my reputation had received yet another unmerited embezzlement. He assumed I'd seen off our assailants single-handed, and I saw no reason to dissuade him. Besides, the conversation I had with the creature had been curiously unsettling, and I found myself reluctant to think too hard about it. I noticed Divas' account had tactfully glossed over the reason why we were in the thick of Tau sympathizers, in the Tau sympathizers' heartland, So maybe they'd finally knocked a little common sense into him. Knowing Divas, though, I doubted it. Well, that's what they get for picking on the Imperium's finest, Castine said, eager to buy the generally accepted version of events as the latest evidence of my exceptional martial abilities reflected well in the regiment she led. She adjusted her own dress uniform, tugging the ochre greatcoat into place with every sign of discomfort. Like most Valhallans, I don't know if I said this in the last stream, but the Valhallans are a guard regiment which comes from the planet Valhalla. And Valhalla is what's known as a death world, which means almost everything on the planet is designed to kill humans. And this particular death world is known that way because it is just a giant ball of ice. If you stand outside for more than 4 seconds without anything, you are becoming a popsicle. And so, like me, if the temperature goes above 70 or so, they will melt like ice. It is said that you can, if you're on a spaceship with Valhallans, you can see your breath because they keep it that cold. Like most Valhallans, she had an ice worlder's tolerance for cold, and found even the mildest of temperate climates a little uncomfortable. Having spent most of my service with Valhallan regiments, I had long become inured to their habit of air conditioning their quarters to temperatures which left the breath smoking, and tended to wear my commissarial greatcoat at all times. But they were still adjusting to the local conditions, here with some difficulty. If I might suggest, Colonel, I said, tropical order might be perfectly acceptable. Would it? She hovered indecisively, reminding me again how young she was to be in such an elevated position, and I felt an unaccustomed pang of sympathy. The prestige of the regiment was in her hands, and it was easy to forget how heavily the responsibility weighed on her. It would, I assured her. She discarded the heavy fur cap, disordering her hair, and began to fasten the coat, and she hesitated. I don't know, she said. If they think I'm too informal, it would reflect badly on all of us. For Emperor's sake, Regina. Oh, that was Brocklow. For Emperor's sake, Regina, Brocklow said, his voice amused. What sort of impression do you have you'll make? What sort of impression do you think you'll make if you're sweating like an orc all evening? I noted his use of her given name. The first time I heard him do so with quiet satisfaction. Another milestone on the 597th's march towards full integration. The real The real test would come with their first taste of combat. Of course, and all too soon at that. It was a good omen. The real test would come with their first taste of combat, of course, and all too soon at that. But it was a good omen. The commissar's right. The commissar's always right, I said, smiling. It says so in the regulations. Well, I can't argue with that. Castine pulled off the coat with evident relief and smoothed the jacket beneath it. It was severely cut, emphasizing her figure in ways I sure would attract the attention of most of the men in the room. Brocklord nodded approvingly. I don't think you'll need to worry about making an impression, he said, proffering a comb. So long as it's a good one. She smoothed her hair into place and began buckling her weapons belt. Like mine, it held a chainsword, but hers was ornately gilded and worked with devotional scenes that decorated scabbard and hilt alike. The contrast with my own functional model, chipped and battered with far too much use for my liking, was striking. The holster at her own hip was immaculate too, the glossy black leather holding a boat pistol which also gleamed from every highly polished surface, and which was intricately engraved with icons of the saints. No doubt about that, I assured her. Her nervousness was quite understandable, as we'd been invited to a diplomatic reception at the governor's palace. At least I had, and the interest of protocol, the colonel of my regiment and an appropriate honor guard would also be expected. This sort of soiree was quite beyond her experience, and she was all too acutely aware that she was out of her depth. I, on the other hand, was well within mine. One of the many benefits of being a hero of the Imperium is that you're regarded as a prime catch by a certain type of society hostess, which meant that I had plenty of opportunities to enjoy the homes, wine cellars, and daughters of the idle rich over the years, and had developed an easy familiarity within a world of which they moved. The main thing to remember as I confided to Castine was that they had their own idea of what soldiers were really like. Which had very little do had very little do had very little to do uh, which had very little to do with the reality. The best thing you can do, I said, is not to get sucked into all that protocol nonsense in the first place. They'll expect us to get it wrong anyway. So to the walk with them. She smiled in spite of herself and settled a little more comfortably into the upholstery of the staff car Jurgen had found somewhere, armed with my commissarial authority, which let him requisition practically anything short of a battleship without argument. He developed quite a talent for acquiring anything I considered necessary for my comfort or convenience over the years. I never asked him any questions about where they'd come from, as I suspected some of the answers might have complicated my life. Oh, that's easy for you to say. I dropped the bottle. That's easy for you to say, she said. You're a hero. I'm just one of the youngest regimental commanders in the entire guard, I said. A position that, in my opinion, you hold entirely on merit, I smiled. And my confidence is not lightly earned. It was what she needed to hear. I've always been good at manipulating people. That's one of the reasons I'm so good at my job. She began to look a little happy. So what do you suggest? I shrugged. They might be rich and powerful, but they're only civilians. However hard they try to hide it, they'll be in all of it. I've always found it best that these things just be a plain... Ooh. Let me check how much this chapter is, because I actually might need something. I thought I could go for a bit longer, but that's not oh boy. Oh no, it's not that bad. Okay, we can do it. We got this. We can do it. I'll get something. What do you suggest? She said. I shrugged. They might be rich and powerful, but they're only civilians. However hard they try to hide it, they'll be in awe of you. I have always found it best that these things just to be a plain, simple military man with no interest in politics. The Emperor appoints, and we obey. Through the warp and far away. She finished the old song line with a smile. So we shouldn't offer any opinions or answer questions about policy. Exactly, I said. If they want to talk, tell them a few stories about your old campaigns. That's all they're interested in anyway. That was certainly true in my case. I was sure I'd only been invited as patriotic window dressing to impress the Tau, the calibre of the opposition they'd be facing if they were foolish enough to try and make a fight of it. Of course, in my case, that meant they could pretty much run their flag up the pole of the governor's palace any time they felt like it. But that was beside the point. Thank you, Caiaphas. Castine put her chin on her hand and watched the streetlights flicker past outside the window. That was the first time anyone in the regiment had addressed me in personal terms since I joined it. It felt strange, but curiously pleasant. You're welcome, Regina, I said, and she smiled. I know what you're thinking, and you're wrong. I did come to think of her as a friend in the end, and Brocklord too, but that's as far as it went. Anything else would have made our positions untenable. Sometimes looking back, I think that's a shame, but there it is. The governor's palace was in what the locals called the Old Quarter, where the fad for the Tau-influenced architecture, which had infected the rest of the city, had failed to take hold. So the vague sense of unease which had oppressed me since we arrived began to lift at last. The villas and mansions slipping past outside the car had taken on the familiar blocky contours of the imperial architecture with which I've been familiar all my life. And I felt my spirits begin to rise to the point where I almost began to anticipate enjoying the evening ahead of us. Jurgen swung the vehicle around to an elaborate pair of wrought iron gates decorated with the imperial aquila, and our tires hissed over a rigged gravel as we progressed through a long curving drive by a flickering flambeau. Flambeau? I think it's flambeau. Behind us, the truck with our honor guard followed, no doubt making a terrible mess of things with its heavy-duty tires. The soldiers making the most of their grandstand view afforded by its open rear decking to point and chatter at the sights. Beyond the flickering firelight, we could make out a rolling landscape of lawn, dotted with shrubs and ornamental fountains. Automatically, some part of my mind was assessing the best way of using them for cover. An audible gasp of Castine signaled that the palace itself had come into view from her side of the window, and a moment later the curve of the drive brought it into my field of vision. Not a bad little billet, I said with an elaborate casualness. Castine composed herself, wiping the bumpkin glop off her face. Reminds me of a bordello we used to visit when I was an officer cadet, she replied, determined to match my blasé exterior. I grinned. Good, I said. Remember, we're soldiers. We're not impressed by this sort of thing. Absolutely not, she agreed, straightening her jacket unnecessarily. There was a lot of the building not to be impressed by. It must have covered over a kilometer from end to end. Although, of course, much of that area would have been given over to courtyards and interior gardens, currently hidden behind the outer wall. Buttresses and conciliations protruded like acne from every surface, encrusted with statuary commemorating previous governors and other local notables no one could now remember the names of. The vast areas had been gilded, reflecting the firelight from the outside in a manner which was to prove eerily prophetic, had we but known. At the time, though, It simply struck me as one of the most stringently vulgar piles of masonry I'd ever encountered. Jurgen pulled up outside the main entrance, halting out, halting out the red, or halting at the red end of the carpet. That's not. I got this. Mm. Halting at the end of the red carpet as skillfully as a pilot entering a docking port. After a moment, the truck pulled up behind us, and our honor guard piled out, deploying on either side of it in a full squad. 5 pairs of troopers facing each other across the crimson weed, las guns at the port. Shall we? I extended an arm to Castine as a flunky dressed as a wedding cake rustled up to open the door for us. Thank you, Commissar. She took it as we emerged, but I stopped for a moment to have a word with Jurgen. Any further orders, sir? I shook my head. Just find somewhere to park and get yourself something to eat, I said. Strictly speaking, I could have had my aide accompany us, but the thought of Jurgen mingling with the cream of the Gravelactian aristocracy was almost too hideous to contemplate. I turned to the nom-com in charge of the honor guard, a Sergeant Lustig, and tapped the combi I'd slipped into my ear. You too, I added. You might as well be comfortable while you wait for us. I'll contact you when we're ready to leave. Yes, sir. A faint smile tried to form on his broad face before discipline reasserted itself, and he inhaled. Squad! Ahead! Done! He bellowed, and they snapped to it with a nanosecond precision. No surprise that they'd won the extra drink ration this week, I thought. The crash of the synchronized heels caused heads to turn all around us, minor local nobles looking mightily impressed, and their chauffeur even more so. I think we've made an impression, Castine murmured as we gained the elaborately carved entrance door. That was the idea, I agreed. Inside it was exactly as I anticipated. The kind of vulgar ostentation too many of the wealthy mistake for good taste, with crystal and gilt and garish tapestries of historic battles and smug-looking pry marks strewn around the place like a pirate's warehouse, carved to mimic the bark of some species of local... Oh, some pirate's warehouse. The high arched ceiling was supported by pillars artfully carved to mimic the bark of some species of local tree, and my feet sank into the carpet as though it were a swamp. It took me a moment to realize that the weave would form a vast portrait, presumably of the governor himself, if viewed from the upper landing, and I noted with a faint amusement that someone had trodden on a dropped canopy, making it look as though his nose was running. Whether it was a genuine accident or the act of a disgruntled servant, who could say? Castine's lip quirked as she absorbed the full opulence of our surroundings. I take it back, she said quietly. A bordello would have been done out in a far better taste. I suppressed a smile of my own as another flunky ushered us forward. Commissar Caiaphas Kane, he announced, and Colonel Regina Castine, which at least established who we were. It was pretty obvious who the unhealthy-looking individual sitting on a raised dais at the end of the room was. I'd met a good few planetary governors in my day, and they all trend towards inbred imbecility. But this specimen looked like he should take the prize. Planetary governors is just another word for king of the planet, which is a job that is inherited. And there's a lot of unfortunate connections to every other planetary governor. 16. Like many of Kane's sweeping generalizations, this does contain an element of truth. The majority, I don't know why I keep pausing to you guys to explain something when it will be immediately explained. Uh, the majority of planetary governors are hereditary positions, and many of the incumbents aren't up to the challenge of the job. However, the truly incompetent tend to be weeded out by the ceaseless round of dynastic power struggles and coup d'etat, which kept the aristocracy amused. In which case, where the imperial interests are directly threatened, we can always turn to the officio assassinator. That's the school where they train assassins. He somehow contrived to look both undernourished and flabby at the same time, and his skin was the pallor of a dead fish. Watery eyes of no particular color goggled at his form under a fringe of thinning gray hair. Governor Grice, I said, bowing formally. A pleasure. On the contrary, he said, his voice quivering a little. The pleasure is entirely mine. Well, he wasn't wrong on that account, but he was ignoring me entirely. He stood and bowed to Castine. You honor us all with your presence, Colonel. Well, that was a new experience. Being ignored in favor of a slip of a girl. But I suppose if you'd ever met her, you'd understand it. She was pretty striking, if redheads were your thing. I suppose the old fool didn't get out much. Anyway, it enabled me to fade out of the picture and go looking for some amusement on my own, which I did with all due dispatch. As was my habit, I circulated widely, keeping my eyes and ears open, as you never know what useful little snippets of information will come in handy. Although, the main thing that caught my attention... Oh, ooh! Okay, this is gonna be good. I just want to prepare for this. If I had time, and I was smart, I'd prepare like some ballroom music. But it's fine. as uh, as was my habit, I circulated widely, keeping my eyes and ears open, as you never know what useful little snippets of information. Oh, oh goodness, please excuse me. Little snippets of information will come in handy. Although the main thing that caught my attention was the entertainment. A young woman, a young woman was standing on a podium at the end of the room, surrounded by musicians who sounded almost as well rehearsed as our regimental band. But they could have been playing orc war drums for all I cared, because her voice was extraordinary. She was singing old, old sentimental favorites, like The Night Before You Left and The Love We Share, and even an old cynic like me could appreciate the emotion she put into it, and feel that, just this once, the trite words were ringing true. Snatches of her husky contralto carried through the room wherever I was, cutting through the backbiting and small talk, and I felt my eyes drifting in her direction every time the crowd parted enough to afford me a view. And the view was well worth it. She was tall and slim, with the shoulder-length hair in a shade of blonde I'd never seen on anyone else before or since, hanging loose to frame a face which nearly stopped my heart. Her eyes were the hazy blue of a far horizon, and seemed to transfix me whenever I looked in her direction. Her dress was the same color, almost exactly. Her dress was the same color almost exactly, and clung to her figure like mist. Now, I've never believed in sentimental nonsense at love at first sight, but I can say without a word of a lie that even now, after almost a century, I can close my eyes and picture her as she was then. And I heard those songs as though she's still in the same room. But I wasn't there to listen to cabaret singing. Cabaret singers, however enchanting. So I tried my best to mingle and pick up whatever gossip I could that would help me fight the Tau if we had to, and keep me out of it if at all possible. So you're the famous Commissar Kane, someone said, passing me a fresh drink. I took it automatically, turning a little to use my right hand and emphasize the sling. I found myself looking at a narrow-faced fellow in an expensive but understated robe which positively screamed diplomat. He glanced at the sling. I hear you nearly started the war early. Not from choice, I can assure you, he said. Just defending an officer who lacked the self-restraint to ignore a blatant piece of sedition. I say. He eyed me narrowly, trying to size me up. I kept my expression neutral. I take it your self-restraint is a little stronger. At the moment, I said, choosing my words with care, we're still at peace with the town. The internal situation here is, I'll admit, a little disturbing, but unless the guard is ordered to intervene, that's purely a matter for the Arbites, the PDF, and His Excellency. I nodded at Grimes, who was listening to Cassine explain the best way of disemboweling a termagant with every sign of interest, although his retinue of sycophants was beginning to look a little green around the gills. I'm not adverse to fighting if I have to, but that's a decision for wiser heads than mine to take. I say. He nodded and stuck out a hand for me to shake. After a moment of juggling, or to put him off balance in anything, I transferred my glass to my other hand and took it. Erasmus Denali, Imperial Envoy. I thought as much. I smiled in return. You have the look of a diplomat about you, whereas you seem quite exceptional for a soldier. Denali sipped his drink, and I followed suit, finding it a very pleasant vintage. Most of them can't wait for the shootings to start. They're Imperial Guard, I said. They live to fight for the Emperor. I'm a commissar. I'm supposed to consider the bigger picture, which includes avoiding combat. You surprised me. As I said before, I told him, that's not my decision to make. But if people like you can solve the conflict by negotiation, and keep troopers who would have died here alive to fight another enemy another day, and maybe tip the balance in a more important battle, then it seems to me that you're serving the interests of the Imperium, and keeping my skin whole in the bargain, of course, which was far more important to me. Denali looked surprised and a little gratified. I can see your reputation is far from exaggerated, he said, and I hope I can oblige you, but it may not be that easy. But that wasn't what I wanted to hear. You can be sure. But I shrugged and sipped my drink. Ah! I'm sorry. I didn't notice that I have been raided. Hello. I've just gone on for 2 minutes. Hi. What's going on? I was like, oh, that funky little 2 number's looking a little bigger there. I really need to find out how to make sounds and stuff happen. Oh my gosh. Hello. Welcome to Storytime. We're a bit in the middle of it. I am Cormano the Mage. I magic. As you can see, I magicked up this chair that doesn't belong to my room. That's Barry the Spider up in the corner. You just have to say hi to Barry. We are reading For the Emperor by Sandy Mitchell. and I hope that you're ready for a nice, relaxing, political evening. Thank you so much for the raid. Oh my gosh. Okay. Uh, okay. I gotta find out where it was. That wasn't what I wanted to hear. You can be sure. But I shrugged and sipped my drink. As the Emperor wills, I said, a phrase I picked up from Jurgen over the course of our long excursion. Oh my gosh! Thank you for the follows. How are you? Of course, when he says it, he means every word. For me, it's just the verbal equivalent of a shrug. I've never really bought the idea that His Divine Majesty could spare some attention from the job of preventing the entire galaxy from sliding into damnation to look out for my interests. Oh, I'm too excited to keep losing my place. Keep looking over. Dirty deeds are done the dirt too cheap. Thank you, Funny Valentine, and I hope the Infinite Multiverse Valentines also follow. I've never really bought the idea that His Divine Majesty can spare some attention from the job of preventing an entire galaxy from sliding into damnation to look out for my interests, too. Or anyone else's, for that matter. Which is why I'm so diligent about doing it myself. Ooh, excuse me. The difficulty, I take it, being the public support for the Tau in certain quarters. Exactly, my new friend nodded gloomily. For what you can thank the imbecile over there. You're talking to your colonel. He indicated Grimes with a tilt of his head. He got so carried away counting his bribes from the likes of him. Another tilt of the head to the far corner of the room. But he can hardly even notice his planet slipping out from under it. So I'll do a tiny bit of explaining for people that have not been here. This is taking place in the Warhammer 40k universe. Our main character is the heroic Commissar Caiaphas Kane, who is the hero of the Imperium. However, he only gained that title by running and hiding from most battles. And most people think he's a great noble hero, when in fact he just kind of manipulates people so that they're in front of him when the shooting starts. Right now, they are on a planet which has been semi-integrating with aliens known as the Tau. And it's been going on for a couple of generations. So the political situation, and the Imperium just brought a lot of guardsmen to this planet. So the political situation is very tense. I turned in the direction he indicated. A cadaverous, hawk-nosed individual dressed in unwise scarlet hose and a burgundy tabard was holding forth to a knot of the local aristocracy. Flanking him were a couple of servants in livery who looked about as comfortable as an orc in an evening dress. Hired guns, if I'd ever seen them. A scribe hovered next to him, making notes. One of the rogue traitors we'd heard so much about, I said. Oh wait. One of the rogue traitors I've heard so much about, I said. Denali shrugged. So he says, but no one hears entirely what they say, Commissar. You can certainly depend on that. Well, he was right on the money so far as I was concerned, so I exchanged a few more inconsequential words and resumed circulating. After a few more conversations with local dignitaries, whose names I never quite caught, my glass was in need of replenishment, and I headed towards the table by the far end of the room, where an enticing display of delicacies had been laid out. On the way, I had noticed Castine had managed to extricate extricate herself from the governor's presence and was working the room as though she'd been a habitué of high society since she could walk. The air of confidence she now radiated was remarkable, especially set against her earlier nervousness. But the ability to seem calm and to control whatever the circumstances is a vital quality in the leader. And for all I knew, she was shamming it as shamelessly as I was. It certainly looked as though she was enjoying herself, though, and I gave her a light-hearted salute as our eyes briefly met. She responded with a flashing grin and whirled away towards the dance floor with a couple of aris, I'll get this, aristocratic fops in tow. It looks like you've lost your date, a voice said behind me. I turned and found myself falling into the wide blue eyes of the singer I'd been watching before. Uncharacteristically for me, I was momentarily at a loss for words. She was smiling, a plate of finger food in her hand. She's a colleague, I said. A fellow officer, nothing like that between us. Strictly against regulations, for one thing. And anyway, we're not. She laughed, a warm, smoky chuckle which warmed me like amasec, and I realized she was pulling my leg. I know, she said. No time for romance in the Imperial Guard. It must be grim for you. We have our duty to the Emperor, I said. For a soldier, that's enough. It's the sort of thing I usually say, and most civilians lap it up. But my beautiful singer was looking at me quizzically, the ghost of a smile quirking at the corner of her mouth, and I suddenly got the feeling that she could see right through me to the core of deceit and self-interest I normally kept concealed from the world. It was an unnerving sensation. For some, maybe, but I think there's more to you than meets the eye. She picked up the bottle from the nearby table with her free hand atop my glass. There's more to everyone than meets the eye, I said, more to deflect the conversation than anything else. She smiled again. That's very astute, Commissar. She extended a hand, slim and cool to the touch, the middle finger ornamented with a large and finely wrought ring of unusual workmanship. Evidently, she was extremely successful in her profession, or at least had one wealthy admirer. I would have laid my money on both. I kissed it, formally as etiquette demanded, and to my astonishment she giggled. A gentleman as well as an officer. You're full of surprises. She then surprised me by dropping a courtesy in imitation of the bovine deputy's surroundings, the light of mischief in her dazzling eyes. I'm Amberly Vale, by the way. I sing a bit. I know, I said, and very well, too. She acknowledged the compliment with a tilt of her head. I bowed formally, entering into the game. Caiaphas Kane, I said, at your service. Currently attached to the Valhalla 597. Her eyes widened a little as I introduced myself. I've heard of you, she said a little breathlessly. Didn't you fight the gene stealers on Kefia? Well, I had, if you count hanging around drinking recaf, while the artillery unit I was with dropped shells on the biggest concentration of stealers we could find from kilometers away, as fighting has been able, as kilometers away as fighting. Oh, that is just too big of a sentence. Well, I had, if you count hanging around drinking recap while the artillery unit I was with dropped shells on the biggest concentration of stealers we could find from kilometers away as fighting. I'd been in at the death, so to speak, and emerged with a great deal of credit, more by luck than good judgment. It was one of the early incidents that had laid the fountains of my undeserved reputation for heroism, but my misadventures since had tended to overshadow what most of the galaxy still regarded as a minor incident on the backwater agri-world. Not entirely alone, I said, slipping easily into the modest hero demeanor. I could adapt without thinking. There was an Imperial battle fleet in orbit at the time, and two full divisions of Imperial Guard on the planet. She laughed away. She laughed again at my astonished expression. Oh, that was her. I'm sorry. And with two full divisions of Imperial Guard on planet. She laughed again at my astonished expression. I have relatives in Slockenberg. You'll still talk about that there. 17. The provincial capital of the smaller of the northern continents. Most of the action in the cleansing of Kefia took place on the southern continent, where the gene stealer cult was most deeply entrenched. So Slockenberg and its population would have been relatively untouched by the fighting. Sorry, don't want to hit the mic. I can't think why, I said. I was just doing my job. Of course, Emily nodded. And again I got the feeling that she wasn't fooled for a moment. You're an Imperial Commissar. Duty before everything, right? Absolutely, I said. And right now, I think it's my duty to ask you to dance. There was a transparent attempt to change the subject, which I hoped she'd put down to modest embarrassment, and I half expected her to refuse. But she smiled, discarding her plate of half-eaten delicacies, and took my uninjured arm. I'd love to. I've got a few minutes before my second set. So we drifted across the dance floor, and I spent a very pleasant few minutes with her head on my shoulder as we spun around to an old waltz I never learned the name of. Castine galloped past a couple of times, a different swain in tow on each occasion, raising an eyebrow in a way which forewarned me of some relentless leg pulling on a drive back to the compound. But just at the moment, I couldn't care less. Eventually, Amberly pulled away, and with what seemed like reluctance, unless I was succumbing to wishful thinking, I began to return to the stage. I walked with her, chatting to no purpose, intent on simply prolonging a pleasant interlude in what otherwise promised to be a dull evening. And it was thus that I noticed a quiet, vehement altercation between Grice and the hawk-faced rogue traitor. Do you know who that is? I asked, not really expecting an answer, but it seemed my companion was well versed in the intricacies of Gravelaxian politics. It came with performing for the aristocracy, I suppose. She nodded, looking surprised. His name is Aurelius, a rogue traitor here to deal with the town. So he said. The qualifications was delivered in precisely the same tone of skepticism as Denali's had been, and for some reason I found myself remembering Divas's cloak and dagger fantasies from her night in the Eagle's Wing. Why do you say that? I asked. Amberly shrugged. The Tau have been dealing with the same traitors for more than a century. Aurelius arrived from nowhere a month or two ago and tried opening negotiations with them through Grice. It may be a coincidence, but... She shrugged, her dress slipping across her slim shoulder. Her dress slipping across her slim shoulders. Why now, with all the political situation destabilizing? I asked. She nodded. That does seem a little unusual. Perhaps he's hoping to take advantage of the confusion to strike a better deal, I said. Aurelius turned on his heel as I watched and marched away, trailed by his bodyguards. Grice was pale and sweating, even more than usual, and reached out to pluck a drink from a nearby servitor with a trembling hand. He's thrown a scare to our illustrious governor at any event. Has he? Amberly watched him go. That seems a little presumptuous, even for a rogue traitor. If that's really what he is, I said without thinking. Those depthless blue eyes turned me on again. What else would he be? An inquisitor, I said, the idea taking firmer root in my head, even as I said it. Everly's eyes widened. An inquisitor? Here? Her voice became a little tremulous, as though the enormity of the idea were too huge to grasp. What makes you think that? Oh, the urge to impress her was almost irresistible, I have to confess. And if you could only know how bewitching she was, you know you'd have felt the same. Though I looked my most commissarial. All I can say, I told her, lowering my voice for dramatic effect, is that I've heard from a reliable military source, which sounded a lot better than from a drunken idiot. I'm sure you'll agree. That there are Inquisition agents active on Gravelax. Surely not. She shook her head, blonde tresses flying in confusion. And even if there were, why would you expect Aurelius? Well, just look at him, I said. Everyone knows that undercover inquisitors disguise themselves as rogue traitors most of the time. 18. It is indeed regrettable that his prediction has become so widely known. Personally, I blame popular fiction for perpetuating the stereotype. Although it has to be said that some inquisitors are simply woefully lacking in imagination when required to adopt a disguise. It's by far the easiest way of traveling incognito without the rabble of hangers-on they all seem to attract. You could be right, she said with a delicate shiver, but it's no concern of ours. Well, I couldn't agree more, of course, but that's not what my heroic reputation leads people to expect of me. So I put on my best dutiful expression and said, the scrutiny of the Imperium is the concern of all His Majesty's loyal servants. Well, that's true, too, and it lets me out, but no one needs to know that. Excuse me. No one needs to know that. Emily nodded somberly and trotted back to the stage, and I watched her go, cursing myself for an idiot for puncturing the mood. As you'll no doubt appreciate, the rest of the evening promised to be anticlimactic, so I drifted back to the food and drink. We're almost there. Just a look at a couple of pages. Our rations back at the compound were adequate enough, but I wasn't going to pass up the opportunity to savor a few delicacies while they were there for the taking. And it was a good vantage point as any to enjoy Emily's performance from. It was also, as I learned from uncountable similar affairs, the best spot from which to cull gossip, which everyone gravitated there sooner or later. Thus it was that I made acquaintance of Aurelius without the faintest presentiment of the trouble that innocent conversation would lead to. If anything, I suppose it was the sling that was to blame. And it seemed a good idea at the time. But now I came to fill a plate. The damn thing got in the way, preventing me from reaching out. Pavline pastries perched on the opposite side of the table. If I transferred the plate to my left hand, I was turned upward. My center of mass shifted, so I couldn't reach. I was trying to work over. Whew, I have completely lost myself. If I transferred the plate to my left hand and turned awkwardly, My center of mass shifted, so I couldn't reach. So I couldn't reach. I was trying to work out a way of getting them when a thin arm reached across to pick up the dish. Allow me. The voice was dry and cultured. I transferred a couple of the delicacies to my plate and found myself addressing the man I'd almost convinced myself was an inquisitorial agent. It was ridiculous, of course, but still. Thank you, Sir Aurelius. You're most kind. Have we met? His eyes were shadowed. The irises were almost black and had an unnerving, piercing quality that increased his resemblance to a bird of prey. Your reputation precedes you, I said blandly, letting him make of that what he would. I don't mind admitting that I was less relaxed than I tried to look. If he really was an inquisitor, there was a good chance he was a psychic too, and might know me for what I was. But I encountered mind beers before and knew that they weren't formidable as most people thought. Most of them could only read surface thoughts, and I was so long practiced at dissembling that I did so without any conscious awareness of the fact. A psyker is someone who has psychic powers. Their soul is connected to uh, this other like magical realm. And they can perform a bunch of magic stuff, but trust me, it's not fun to be a psyker. Let's see. Oh, where was it? There we go. I'm sure it does. He was an old hand at this game too, I realized. An essential skill whether his profession was as it appeared, or as I said surmised. You seem to have the ear of His Excellency, I said, and for the first momentary flicker of emotion appeared on his face. I got under his guard, it seemed. I have both, unfortunately. His Excellency appears to lack anything between them. He took. Jeez, I'm so hungry. We're almost there. I have both, unfortunately. His Excellency appears to lack anything between them. He took one of the pastries for himself. He is paralyzed with indecision. Indecision about what? I asked ingenuously. Where his best interests lie, and though most and those of his people, of course. Aurelius bit into the delicacy as though it were Grice's neck. Unless he starts showing some leadership, this world will go down in blood and burning. But he sits and facilitates and hopes it'll all go away. Let's hope he comes to his senses soon, I said. The keen eyes impaled me again. Indeed. His voice was level, for all our sakes. He smiled then, without warmth. The Emperor be with you, Commissar Kane. My surprise must have shown on my face, because the smile widened a fraction. Your reputation precedes you, too. And then he was gone, leaving me curiously troubled. I didn't have long to dwell on my unease, though, because the flunky who announced our arrival was back, looking a little flustered. He called out a number of names since Castine, and I hadn't made... He called out a number of names since Castine and I had made our entrance, but it was clear that this time he expected to be listened to. He pounded a staff on the polished wooden floor, and the babble of voices gradually diminished. Amberley's trailed away in mid-chorus, which was a real shame. The flunky's chest inflated with self-importance. Your Excellency, my lords, ladies, and gentlemen, Oran Shui Sase, Ambassador of the Tau. And for the first time since arriving on Gravelax, I was face to face with the enemy. Shabam! Is that enough book closing ASMR? Shabam! Oh my goodness, I am practically starving. But that will bring us to an end for this session of reading. That was chapter. We ended on chapter 4, and I just want to thank Viz for the raid, which was super awesome and cool and awesome. And did I mention cool? Thank you, Pope Frankie, Kitten OO, and D4C Funny Valentines for the follow this evening. And thank everyone for lurking and listening to my tales. I will be starting work up here soon, so I'll have an actual schedule to work off streaming. And as soon as possible, I will make sure that we have another book reading stream soon. Because I'm really enjoying this, and I just love reading to people. So for now, as we round off our evening, let's go ahead and see who we want to read. And as I pull up my Twitch dashboard, which I never do before the stream like I probably should. Alright, let's see who's going. Who's going right now? Oh, we could read Heavenly. That's definitely what we're gonna do. I think Hey It's Heavenly is either currently affiliate or still pushing for affiliate. I think they might be like just waiting for stuff to come back. They are very cool, and we're gonna go ahead and give them a nice raid. As we wait for that to go ahead and load in. Again, I want to thank everyone for stopping by. I had a really good evening. I hope everything sounded good because I kind of had my headphones off the whole time to hear myself better. I hope you have a very wonderful evening. Bye.